bit more loudly and clearly so that all of us can hear, please? Points and saying.
Okay. Yeah, especially remembering that there's some people here who have some hearing difficulties, so yeah, please try to speak clearly and reasonably loudly. So yeah, I guess I'll talk a little bit more.
It doesn't work.
Seems not to work. Okay, I'll just do the audio then on this.
Your audio.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I'll continue for a little bit on the Vaibhashikas and the two truths, since that's the main topic. So, and one thing that's very important with all of this, this terminology, like conventional truth, ultimate truth, emptiness, selflessness, and so on, all of these terms, we have to be careful that they are defined differently by the different philosophical schools. So if we assume that emptiness means what we've always been taught emptiness is, because we've been usually taught from the Prasangika point of view, then it can cause confusion sometimes. We have to, this is one of the trickiest things about all this, is that, they say something, well, how can that be true? Because you have not taken into account that the definition of that term in that school is different from the one that you're used to. So this is where it can get a little bit complicated. So, but definitely each school has a different definition of conventional and ultimate truth. Okay. So in Vaibhashika, and this is, the Vaibhashika system that is taught in the Tibetan monasteries. So according to this book that Tim's just shown me, there are 34 different Vaibhashika schools. The Tibetans only found 18, but this French person has found 34 different ones. But we're not going to go into all that. You'll be glad to know. So how do they define conventional truth? All of them, there's one thing in common, that anything is not a conventional truth is an ultimate truth, and anything that's not an ultimate truth is a conventional truth. There's only two possibilities. Okay. So, and what does it mean in general? This is a very important, I think, it's very important to have a sense of it, even though they may define them slightly differently, but the purpose is really the same, is that, as we said at the very beginning yesterday, until we start to do this kind of questioning, this kind of philosophical investigation, we just assume that things exist the way that they appear, don't we? So we see something, we think that's the way that thing exists. But then we may find that when we investigate more closely, it can't exist in that way. So then we start to say, okay, well, how do things really exist? Ultimately, ultimate means last. So, finally, when we finish that process, when we've investigated, and sort of logically analysed it as much as we can, what do we then come down to? That doesn't just kind of disappear when we analyse it. So even the Vaibhashikas say that the self, that me, I assume that I exist as something concrete and independent, and I'm not just a collection of mind and body. Naturally I assume that. That's how I operate my life, as if that were true. But when I investigate, I find that doesn't make sense. There's just consciousness, and then there's a physical body. But where is this I? I can't be found. So the ultimate truth is what we find when we analyze things, as far as they can be analyzed. Then if there's still something left, that's an ultimate truth. Okay. So the Vaibhashikas, what their analysis that they're doing is saying, well, this table, if you take it to pieces, all the pieces are still there. Nothing has been sort of somehow mysteriously vanished out of existence, but there's no table. So the table doesn't exist in its own right. It's just the parts of the table. They exist, but then they can be cut up too. So eventually we get down to these particles that can't be cut up any further. And then so they must be the ultimate truth. This is what the Vaibhashikas say. And the other schools say, well, even those, when we try to analyze, logically we can't make sense of it. Like, do they have sides or not? Do they have the earth, air, fire, and water particles or not? It's by using logical arguments, they find is a contradiction there. It can't be made logically consistent. So, but for the Vaibhashikas, they're happy with it. They think, yeah, that's all. They're happy with those tenets. So they're happy that these partless particles, they are ultimate truths. And again, remember, in English, normally when we talk about truth, we kind of mean a statement. But in the Tibetan, the Buddhist philosophical way of speaking, they're talking about the object itself as a truth. Something that does exist is a truth. All right, that's non-standard English usage, but that's just, I mean, it's a translation. It's not, that's the way that term in Sanskrit and Tibetan was used. It's not so much about a statement as about a thing. So a thing that does exist is a truth. And if, no matter how much we analyze, we still find that thing, then it's an ultimate truth. So the example of a pot comes up over and over again. There's always a pot in the tenets. So we see a pot and we think, that's real. That's a real thing. And it is. It's a conventional truth. There is a pot there. But if we break it up, then there's no pot. So even if we mentally separate it into its parts, we no longer think there's a pot there. Okay. So the definition, I'll read it out. Definition of conventional truth by the Vaibhashikas is anything which is such that if it was physically destroyed or mentally broken up into parts, the consciousness apprehending it would be cancelled. Right. So if I think of this table and then I think of pulling it to pieces so that there's just some bits of wood, I wouldn't no longer be thinking of it as a table. Right? Or if I think of a pot and I think the pot being smashed to pieces, there's no longer a pot. Right? If I'm looking at a pot, then if I'm thinking about a pot, it's a mental consciousness. But if I'm seeing the pot, it's an eye consciousness. That is, apprehends the pot or perceives the pot. Okay. And if somebody smashes the pot, then the eye consciousness no longer perceives the pot. So that's their definition. Read it again. Anything which is such that if it was physically destroyed or mentally broken up into parts, the consciousness apprehending it would be cancelled. Yeah. So if the pot is broken into pieces, the eye consciousness no longer sees a pot. So, but they say, because that process of taking things to pieces can't go on forever, must come to a stop somewhere. There must be, there must be real particles that everything is all made up of. Then those things cannot be broken into pieces, and so therefore, that consciousness that sees them would not be destroyed, because they can't be broken into pieces. So according to the Vaibhashikas, when I see the pot, I'm actually seeing all of those tiny, tiny particles, even though they're small, so small that they have no parts. All right? But I don't know how they deal with the fact that I'm not aware of seeing millions of tiny particles. But they say that the consciousness does perceive each particle. Okay.
Isn't that true of colour?
Colour?
Yeah, you know when they do, on TV and stuff where they use like lots of different dots of colour to come up with one colour, and then they use combinations of it. So in that respect, it is little bits of things that come together to.
Yes.
Yeah.
But there's still a question about, is there a consciousness that perceives each one, or is it just a consciousness that perceives the whole collection
I don't know.
of dots?
I think the mind is quite vast, so it probably. I can't honestly say experientially that when I look at turquoise, I'm seeing yellow and green together, and then I'm putting it all together in my mind, and now I see turquoise. But that is how you arrive at that colour. So it must sort of, to me, it follows that it must sort of flow somewhere along those lines.
I mean, that's a good reasoning, but you could also argue the other way, that that's a physical process that happens in the eye, but there's no consciousness that sees a yellow and a consciousness that sees a blue. There's just a consciousness seeing turquoise. So that would be an interesting debate to see if you could come to a conclusion which of those is correct. You see the kind of debates that can happen. And there is that debate about the Vaibhashikas, whether there is a consciousness that sees each tiny particle. They're much tinier than the dots on a TV screen. They have no parts at all. So, but you can see how they get that, that debate. But they have to say that the consciousness apprehends the particles because, as I said yesterday, in the Tibetan or in the Buddhist view that we're looking at, they don't say that something can exist without being able to be perceived by a mind. Okay, I mentioned that. The definition of an existent phenomenon is whatever is the object of a valid cognition. A mind, correctly perceiving mind, has to see it. So the Vaibhashikas have to say that these partless particles, even though they're so tiny, the mind does perceive them. And this we'll see there's a difference between them and the next school, the Sautrantikas. They look at it a different way. So we'll see that next time. We might even come back to that point.
That might also be debatable.
Might be what?
Debatable.
Everything's debatable. Yeah, sure, that's right. Yeah.
But what about things, you say that the mind has to be able to see them. So, would they include, in their day, they would have been equivalent to the microscope. But if a mind the mind wouldn't physically be able to see these partless particles, so that because they're so small. So how is the consciousness to apprehend them?
Well, that's exactly the question, Jenny. And so there are different ways you can, because the Vaibhashikas are kind of, it's sort of rather literal-minded. So their idea is that if there's a partless particle there must be a consciousness that perceives it in order for the whole consciousness to perceive the whole object. You see what I mean? So they're like this, they're quite a simple view of the correspondence between the object and the consciousness. If the object's made up of millions of tiny particles, the consciousness must kind of be made up of little tiny consciousnesses that perceive each particle. So it's a rather simple-minded view, and the Sautrantikas have a bit more sophisticated view, and they don't accept the partless particles, but they accept that the consciousness is able to perceive the whole. Oh, they do accept partless particles. That's right. Yeah, but they don't think they're ultimate truths. Anyway. We'll probably come back to that. But yeah, you can see now there are these different interpretations of what's happening. Right, so if the part is not an ultimate truth, it's a conventional truth, how does it exist? Because it does exist, they do say that it exists. but they say that it exists imputedly. Okay? That is to say, it's because when we see the parts of the pot collected together in a certain way, we label that as a pot. And the same with a person. When we see the body and mind connected together in a certain way, we label that as a person. But it's not that from its own side. Okay, a pot isn't, it's just we put that label onto that collection of parts. The pot itself doesn't exist, as they say, substantially from its own side. It's just how we name it, how we conceptualize it. Whereas the partless particles, they say they exist substantially. There's nothing, as I put it in the notes, they just exist whether we like it or not. Okay, we haven't got any choice about that. Whereas with the sort of larger scale objects, I can label things. Sometimes I can label things differently. So yeah, somebody talked about, yeah, if you turn the table upside down, I might label it something else. You know, so how I impute onto this collection of parts that's something to do with me. It's my, it's from the side of the consciousness. There's something happening there. But the Vaibhashikas say there's something also from the side of the object, the partless particles, and anything that is an ultimate truth, that has that nature from its own side, independently of the mind. Okay. Whereas the conventional truth, like the pot, it's something that we impute onto that collection. So the terminology is that the pot exists imputedly, and the partless particles exist substantially. They exist. Their existence is something that is independent of our mind attributing or imputing existence to it.
But it isn't the object itself, though, that determines whether it's Dawn's willy holder, or whether it's a table.
Yeah. So that's a conventional truth, and so that nature is something that we impute to it. But according to the Vaibhashikas, the partless particles have their nature independently of the mind. Okay? Obviously the Prasangikas would definitely disagree with that.
Sorry, David, I don't understand the parts.
Partless particles, yeah.
Yeah, I don't understand
Okay,
what you mean by
yeah. So the argument is that any sort of large-scale object like the table can be taken apart, so it doesn't exist in its own right. It's just a collection of parts, okay? And the parts can be cut up, into more smaller parts and so on. Then there's a question: does that process ever come to an end? Do you ever come to a point where there's something you can't cut up anymore? So what do you think? I mean,
that would be partless parts.
Well, that's what the Vaibhashikas say. They say that if you come to that, they must come to that point. There must be something there that, can't be cut up anymore. If it can't be cut up anymore, it can't have any parts itself, because if it had parts, it could be cut up. Yeah? That's the reasoning. And, you might accept that reasoning or you might not. But the other schools don't agree that there's any such thing as a partless particle. But if you think that things, physical things exist independently of the mind, you're probably going to come to that conclusion. The other schools, they especially the higher schools, the Mahayana schools, they don't think that physical things exist from their own side in that way. So they say, well, since it's only how the mind imputes it, you don't have to decide about whether there's such a thing as a partless particle or not. That's just a concept, doesn't have any reality to it. But if you think it exists from its own side, you've got to say, well, is there a smallest particle or not? And if there is, does it have parts or doesn't it? You've got to have a conclusion about that. So that's how the other schools disprove it, because whichever side you take, you end up with a contradiction. So that view of things existing independently of the mind, the higher schools, they say, well, that doesn't stand up. When you analyse, you find that you can't make sense of that idea. So they say everything is imputed. Well, the Prasangikas do. Yeah? Does that help? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Lois. Yeah. Yeah.
This goes well together with classical physics.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. So it's very much, that classical physics was influenced by the Greek philosophy of atomism, which is very similar to the Vaibhashika philosophy, except that the Greek atoms, they're not necessarily infinitely small, whereas the Vaibhashika ones, they are completely partless. They're presumably they're infinitely small, but it's very similar. Generally speaking, it's a very similar idea, and that philosophy was very influential in the development of classical physics, up to and beyond the time of Newton, right up to the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century. So you can say that most of the development of Western physics was from a Vaibhashika view. CERN, yeah.
Places in France, Switzerland, where they're trying to sort of split atoms. And I remember I used to work near there. One year they did an experiment which potentially could have blown us all to smithereens.
Yes.
Still went to work, but it's kind of like this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to split the
find the partless particles
of the atom
yeah.
and stuff like this. So it's that I sort of understand it in those terms, where you've got your atoms that are made up of protons and whatever, and then they're trying to split those down into something.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
And they succeeded?
I don't know.
Well, they succeeded. That experiment was to try to find a particle called the Higgs boson, and they did find that particle eventually. But the thing is, when they're splitting these particles down, each time they split it now, it gets bigger. Because they have to put an enormous amount of energy in to split it.
Technically, don't really split it.
No.
What they do is take two protons, accelerate them very, very fast,
Yeah.
make it collide, so a lot of energy comes out,
Yeah.
and maybe one of the bigger particles then
Fall out.
is generated.
Yeah. Yeah. So here we can't really think of these things as particles anymore. They're not. They're kind of, it's a form of energy that is in a certain form, and then when they because collision happens, then it's transformed into a different form of energy. So modern physics doesn't think really in terms of particles in the same way. But for hundreds of years, that view was able to support the development of very, very sophisticated physics and chemistry and all the rest of it. So it's quite a profound philosophy. But there's some contradictions to be found within it, if you analyze it logically, it doesn't stand up. And so then you go to the next level. So I think I'm going to just... I don't think there's anything very important to be said more about the tenet. So just the rest of the session we'll keep going with the Q&A. I'm sure there'll be more questions.
Didn't the Greek particles in Democritus' model have hooks on them, so they could connect with other particles?
I don't know whether Democritus said that. I mean, some of the atomists did. They had quite a sophisticated theory of how the different shapes of the atoms led to have them having different, when they came together, that they would create substances with different properties. And that was, Plato sort of developed that as well. Yes, there was. I think there were some that had hooks. Others, like there were the sharp ones, which was the fire, and then there was this cubical ones, which was the earth, because they can fit together nicely and make something solid, etc. Yeah, all those different ideas. Very interesting, some of the theories that they can account for, all of the different, vastly different things that we see from something very, very simple and basic, so we're kind of reducing it down to, this is all of this in the Greek philosophers and in the Indian non-Buddhist schools and the Buddhist schools is very much about, what is reality really like, because it can't be how it appears to be. So they're all searching for ultimate truth in their own way, and they're coming up with different theories of what is the ultimate truth. Yeah.
So anyway, this little sort of mini daydream, I had this sort of amoeba.
Yeah.
And then I sort of thought, well, an amoeba, okay, it doesn't have a specific shape, because I was thinking about what you were saying about no northwest, east, south, top and bottom. And I thought, well, the shape's changing.
Yes.
But I thought, but if it's big enough to detect that the shape is changing, you'd still imagine it would be possible to cut it up and divide it.
Exactly.
So it just doesn't really quite seem to work somehow, does it?
Yeah, so you can see how that, like, there's a logical argument that leads to one conclusion and another logical argument that leads to the opposite conclusion. You end up with a contradiction. You can't, so you either have to sort of find a way to fit it together to resolve the contradiction, or else you reject that view altogether, that there's any such thing as a partless particle. You have those two, you always have those two options. And that's how the debate goes,
But I can also
like ping pong.
that people without the advantage of all the, scientific knowledge that we've got now,
Yeah.
and whatnot, I can understand the idea of some sort of basic building block that seem to make an awful lot of sense in terms of explaining the universe and sort of how it is.
It's amazing how far they got without, that kind of technology and so on. Yeah, with explaining things. Yeah. But they ended up in problems, so we're going to explore that this afternoon.
Can you say that consciousness is an uncompounded phenomena, but is dependent, in order to exist, is dependent to compounded phenomena?
No, I didn't say that it was uncompounded. Consciousness is a compounded phenomenon.
Yeah. Okay. So consciousness is compounded.
Yes. So it has parts, the moments of consciousness are the parts.
Okay.
Is that what continuum means?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So continuum is like the mind consists of, moment after moment after moment of consciousness, and there's no time when there isn't a consciousness. Depending on the different schools, whether that moment has any sort of finite duration is also debated about. So the lower schools say that, the moment of consciousness, it comes into existence and then it exists for a little small time and then it disappears and the next moment comes. The higher schools say that that moment of it is disintegrates as soon as it comes into existence. So it doesn't exist for. Well, when we talk about a moment, does that moment have parts or not? The question: Does that consciousness, does it exist unchanging for any period of time at all? And the higher schools say no, it doesn't. Its duration is infinitesimal, if that's meaningful. There's
the karma load. Where is it in the Vaibhashika?
The karma.
The karma.
Where is it?
There is a store for the karma.
They don't talk about the store consciousness. I think they probably would say that the karma is form.
Form.
Yeah.
Physical.
Yeah.
There is no consciousness about the karma.
But when you ask about how it's stored, how the karma is stored. I think that's right. I may need to check that. But, I don't think they assert the store consciousness, the alaya consciousness. We'll talk about that later. That's from many in the Yogacara school. They talk about that, but also in one of the subdivisions of the Madhyamika as well. They also say that.
They believe in karma, like.
They believe in karma, definitely. All these, because they're Buddhist schools, they necessarily believe in karma. They believe the Four Noble Truths. They believe, yeah, definitely.
Where does the karma come from? From previous moment? For the
Vaibhashika, I don't know the details of that. Anybody know? You? But I think probably they would say it is stored as a form. But I'm not sure. They don't have a special consciousness anyway for it to be stored in. I don't know.
David, how would these guys deal with the koan? Do you know about the tree falling and nobody hearing it, so did it make a sound? Would they say because a mind has not seen it, no? Because Jenny talked a little bit about, didn't she?
Yeah.
Things that you might not be able to physically see with a consciousness because we just didn't have the technology. They would have had the technology to see a tree fall.
Yes.
But nobody did. So would they say because the mind didn't perceive it, would that be this school's view on that koan?
I was thinking about that yesterday, but I was thinking on the, was that the part on the Yogacara?
Mm-hmm.
Because it says mind only.
Mind only, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking about what you just said then. Does that come into that part there?
They would probably deal with that koan a bit differently from the Vaibhashikas, yeah. Yeah, okay.
The debate, what would
yeah.
view of that
So, yeah, I mean, if the tree, I think probably I would say what the Vaibhashikas would say, if the tree falling is an existent phenomenon, if there is a tree that falls, then there is a sound. Because the sound, for them, the sound is form, it's a physical thing.
It wasn't captured by a consciousness, but that doesn't
No. Well, if the tree falling is an existent phenomenon, there must be a consciousness that knows that, mustn't it? You're thinking about a tree falling, then if you're thinking about a tree falling, you know, when you think about a tree falling, does that tree make a sound when you think about it? It does, doesn't it? The sound.
Did that tree make a sound? Well, I suppose we're thinking about it now, aren't we?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So you can't, you know, you can't. I'm going to make a statement now. You can debate with me, but my statement is, I don't think you can give me an example of something that exists that is not thought about by a mind.
Well, no, because I give you the example.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's a good one. Yeah. There's another answer though that's always given by all the Buddhist schools actually to that. Because there is, if a tree falls in the forest, it is seen and heard, because the Buddha's mind perceives all phenomena. So there's an omniscient mind that perceives them all. That's how they get out of it. But there's some great questions here, so keep them coming, keep them coming. We've got about another, well, I think we'll give it another 10 minutes if there are still questions. So this is what it's all about. Let's kind of get our minds working instead of just, don't soak everything up like a sponge. That's
Vaibhashika have a set definition of the duration of a moment.
I think they do, and I'm not totally sure, but I think Vaibhashika would say that, yeah, it's the definition that's usually given, and I don't know whether it's from Vaibhashika or one of the other schools, that it's a 1/64th of a finger snap, because they say that's the shortest time that the mind can perceive anything.
Right. Pretty sure.
65.
No, and there's one school that says it's 165th, I think, as well. Yeah. They actually probably debate about that.
That would be a debate between the two schools. I'd like to listen to that one.
No, there is probably reason, because when they talk about that finger snap is divided into 64, which there are different things happening in each of those sort of sub-moments of a consciousness, if you like. Yeah.
I was wondering, but I don't know if it's not necessarily related with the different
Okay, doesn't matter.
schools. It's just about the enlightened mind,
Yeah.
or the enlightened consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Would that mean that it has some kind of permanent state of mind? Is there anything there that is somehow
That's a good question.
compounded? Because is it changing? But I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a good question.
I don't understand really enlightenment that much.
It's very difficult to understand, you know, the enlightened mind is a very, very deep topic. What is the nature of the enlightened mind? So that is a good question. Is it permanent or impermanent? Because in every moment, the enlightened consciousness, the Dharmakaya, the Buddha's mind, knows every phenomenon. So you could say, well, is it different from one moment to the next? And I think the answer that's given, it depends from what point of view, because from our point of view, you know, for us, we can say, oh, this moment of the Buddha's mind, and then the next moment, the previous moment. From the Buddha's point of view, the Buddha perceives the ultimate truth directly, and in the ultimate truth, emptiness, there's no differentiation at all, anyway. So from his point of view, it's permanent. From the ultimate point of view, I think this is probably, this would get by with the Geshes. From the ultimate point of view, is permanent. From the conventional point of view, it's impermanent. But that's, you know, this is exactly the kind of thing where you would get in the debating yard. They would really get to town on that one. I can't give you a definitive answer, because here, you know, we're getting outside of the territory where there's a definitive answer, you know, like a textbook answer. These are things we can debate and think about. So I think it's much more creative. We can start to really, you know, use our mind, and we don't necessarily come to a definite conclusion. Of course, when we reach the enlightenment ourselves, then we do know. Yeah, no, good one. That's a very good question to think about.
But didn't you say yesterday that one of the differences between the enlightened mind and, say, the arahats was that the enlightened mind had the capacity to understand ultimate truth and conventional truth simultaneously? Yeah,
we do. So the Buddha himself, he you know, if we accept that conventionally it's impermanent, but ultimately it's permanent, he apprehends, he knows those two different perspectives simultaneously. So, you know, the Buddha's mind is very deep. It's very, you know, not easy to understand the nature of the fully enlightened mind. Okay, well, we all seem to have been struck dumb now, so I guess we can we can stop for lunch. It's 1 o'clock. Is that all right? Has anyone really got any burning questions? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we'll come back at 2 o'clock.